Welcome, and I'm going to be taking you through a most interesting poem and experience called Ozymandias, which was written by Percy Bysshe Shelley back in the early 1800s. And it's a famous poem, but the story behind it is even more intriguing. It was written by Percy Bysshe Shelley, and Shelley was seen as one of the superstars of his time. Poets were seen a little bit like mega rock stars of today. And these poets were called the Romantic poets. Romanticism was a form of literature, poetry that was based around rebellion against authority. It had a link with nature and the wonders and beauty of nature, the untamed spirit, and love. He was born on the 4th of August, 1792, in England, to a very famous and powerful, wealthy, aristocratic family. It's interesting to know that 1792 is about 4 years after the colonization of Australia in 1788. When England started to colonize Australia with the convicts, we had these people being born into a very hierarchical, aristocratic society back in England. And Percy Bysshe Shelley had an amazing life, although, interestingly, he didn't live to the age of 30. He was 1 month off, or a couple of months off, turning 30. And he was famously to say, "If I die tomorrow, I shall have outlived my father. I am 90 years old." Now, he couldn't possibly have been 90, and he didn't outlive his father. But what he was suggesting with this quote was that he had a very action packed, full life, even at the age of 29. And he did experience some incredible links with famous people. He was up there with the likes of Lord Byron, which is an interesting one because Byron Bay has Byron's name in it. And also Percy Bysshe Shelley was a couple of years survived after John Keats, who was another famous romantic poet. And John Keats died of disease, and Percy Shelley, when he died, drowning in a boat, when he was coming back to Italy, they found in his top pocket a book of poetry by John Keats. So he died and he washed up on a beach about 8 days later, and that's when they found him. And his friends were immediately in states of grief. His wife, Mary, was heartbroken. And you might know Mary because she's very famous herself. Mary Shelley was Percy's wife. And during a party that they were having, a seance actually, in Switzerland on Lake Geneva, they had a challenge set themselves. And this group of people staying in the house said, "Hey, let's try to write a ghost story. And the person who writes the best ghost story will be the winner." Now, interestingly, that night, Mary went to bed and had a terrible dream of a monster. She woke up and she started to write her story, which became the very famous story, Frankenstein. It's interesting to know that Frankenstein is not what we perceive to be the monster. Frankenstein is Dr. Frankenstein. The monster is the monster. Now, more bizarre is that when Mary died long after Percy's death, and Percy, as you can see in the picture, was cremated in a fire on the beach. And when they burnt his body, it was meant to be very hot, but the story goes that part of him did not burn, and they thought it was his heart. And Mary received the heart and kept it in her locker box all her life. And when her son was going through her things, he found wrapped up the heart, or allegedly the heart, of Percy Bysshe Shelley, who she'd kept all that time. So, some interesting background to this poem, but the poem is a famous poem, and I'm going to read it to you. It's called Ozymandias. "I met a traveller from an antique land who said, 'Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains round the decay of that colossal wreck. Boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. Now, this poem, like all poems, when you read it only once, it's a little confusing because there are so many ideas wrapped up in this poem. I'm going to start to unpack it for you a little bit because I find it fascinating that when we start to analyze poetry, we can see the art of a classic poet and the thinking of a classic poet. And you can see here the draft, one of the original drafts of this poem. So let me take you through the understanding that Ozymandias wasn't the only poem. Just like Mary Shelley had a competition to write her horror story, so we had Percy Bysshe Shelley in a sonnet competition with his good friend and accountant who managed his finances, Horace Smith. And they both submitted the same poem, or of the title, the same title, to a competition in a newspaper. And this is Horace Smith's story or poem. He says, In Egypt's sandy silence, all alone, stands a gigantic leg, which far off throws the only shadow that the desert knows. I am great Ozymandias, saith the stone. The King of Kings this mighty city shows, the wonders of my hand. The city's gone, naught but the leg remaining to disclose the site of this forgotten Babylon. We wonder, and some hunter may express wonder like ours when thro' the wilderness where London stood, holding the wolf in chase, he meets some fragment huge and stops to guess what powerful but unrecorded race once dwelt in that annihilated place. Now that's Horace Smith's attempt, and it's a lesser known poem. It's not a very famous poem at all. It didn't stand the test of time. However, we do know that Ozymandias from Percy Bysshe Shelley did survive. So I'm going to show you what this poem's all about. And when I'm talking to you about this poem, the first thing we need to understand is the title, Ozymandias. Now, when we say Ozymandias, we're not trying to say Mandias because I'm going to show you how this poem is structured. The first thing is, this poem is an interesting poem because it sets out with the narrator. And the narrator is in this part of the poem talking about meeting a traveler from an antique land who said, so here we are, and we're sitting here understanding that there was a person who met someone, and that person is telling us the story. And what did the person he met say, this traveler? This whole section here is the story the traveler said. And you can see that it's got a quotation mark and a quotation mark, or speech marks. These speech marks is the story that's being relayed to the traveler, who's now relaying it to you, the reader, or the person who is listening to this poem. And it's an interesting one because Percy Bysshe Shelley is talking about two vast and trunkless legs of stone. Trunkless means it doesn't have a body. These are just legs of stone, and they're standing in the desert by themselves. Near them on the sand, because it's a desert, half sunk, a shattered visage lies. Now, a visage is the face, and you can see down here, we've got the word visage. It's like a visor, the same thing comes through, or sometimes you've heard the word supervisor. But visage is an old word which just simply means face. So what we're seeing here is there are two legs in this desert, and there's a face lying beside them. Now, what sort of face is it? Well, it's half sunk, so it's half sunk in the desert, and it's a bit shattered, means it's been there for a long time. We know it's a long time because not only is it shattered, but if we look up here, we've got this use of the word antique. Now, Shelley could have used old, he could have used ancient, but antique has this feeling of wealth that is associated with it. And this visage lies as in it's half buried, lying beside these two legs. But what does the visage look like? Well, it's not a very nice face. It's got a frown, it's got a wrinkled lip, and it's a sneer of cold command. This is someone who's got power and arrogance and doesn't respect the little people. This is a king. But the interesting thing is that this is who created the sculpture. Do you see, we've got a king that is being modeled into this great statue, but we've got the artist, the sculptor, who was able to read those passions. And it's the artist's work which is surviving. And the artist, the sculptor, cutting out the stone, he stamped on these lifeless things. This stone, you can see how it's cold and stoneless and heartless. The hand that mocked them. Now, mocked is interesting because remember the Romanticists, the Romantic poets, I said, were rebellious against authority. And here's an indication of that too. So the sculptor is creating this massive statue of this person, and he is mocking the qualities of the person. And not only is he mocking them, but we can see here the heart that fed. This is the person, the king, the person who has this cold command. He's actually got an ego. He's arrogant, and he's loving this idea of this great statue being created. So much so, he's forgetting that the sculptor is the artist, mocking him. Now, on the pedestal, the pedestal in this case is where the feet are, ped, like pedal. The pedestal is the base of this great statue, and there's something written on the base. These are the words that appear. So these words were written and carved into this stone and tell us what this king, this wrinkled lip, this person with a sneer, with cold command, with a heart that fed, this ego. He says, and notice how it's in, again, single italics. He says, "My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair." So what does this mean? Well, this is a really interesting piece because in these two lines, we're actually seeing that the King of Kings is this heart that fed, the ego of the person believing that he's above everybody else in all time. So he's created this statue of himself so others would come by and look at it and just be desperately impressed. They would look up and they'll think, I'm never going to be that good. And who would be doing that? The mighty. In the centuries to come from this great ruler, anybody who saw his works would realize that they are not the mightiest, that Ozymandias is really the King of Kings. So there's this amazing story where we're hearing a traveler tell us about someone talking to him. Tell us about a sculptor who created something thousands of years ago. And this great statue was the work of a king of kings. But sadly, or more importantly, when the Romanticists are talking about the power of nature, nothing beside remains now. So now, if you go and see this massive statue of this powerful king, the words have this hollowness. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. It's not because he's the King of Kings, it's because nature has destroyed any trace of his civilization. There's decay around that colossal wreck. And notice the capital letters here to make it seem as if it's a significant one of a kind. And it's interesting to note, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away. There's no life. Nature has taken back over this statue, this civilization. And so the words of mighty, of a king of kings, of being in despair, has a poignancy because it's now the power of nature that overcomes humans. Now, that's understanding the story of the poem and the structure of what's being said by Percy Bysshe Shelley. But now we start looking at this poem, we see the structure. And if I look at each syllable, I met a traveler from an antique land. It's interesting to note that there are 10 syllables. Now, if I look at who, said, to, vast, and, trunk, less, legs of stone, there are another 10. And this is famous because what we're seeing here are the syllables in a line of poetry. So 10 syllables each line. Now, the reason that's important is the syllables create the rhythm of a poem. And where we have words, we can have stress and emphasis placed on a word. I met a traveler from an antique land. It's got rhythm now. Who said to vast and trunkless legs of stone. So this is how you get rhythm in your poems. And Percy Bysshe Shelley has intentionally created 10 syllables for every line. He's also created poetry. Most of us think poetry has to be read line by line. But if you noticed here, there isn't a punctuation mark, a full stop, a comma, a dash at the end of this line. So when we're reading this poem, we are to read it straight through. Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Now, it's interesting to note there's the repetition of s coming through. Do you notice that? This is called alliteration. And alliteration is a device. It's a poetic or a literary device to make our minds hear the words. And when you go through this, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown. Now, the sound of words or letters creates another feel. Notice how these two words are powerful because it's k. The k sound is a harsh sound which jars, and it's a sneer of cold command. So this alliteration is creating that power. And when we go through as well, let's start looking at the last words of a line, because this is where rhyme is. We've got land, stone. But if I look at the next, it's sand. Sand and land rhyme. Stone and frown, they're not perfect rhymes, but they are near rhymes. So he's intentionally looking at a word that will fit here. And look at this, command sand, land. So Percy Bysshe Shelley is creating a poem where he's looking at the syllables, he's looking at the devices he's applying to it, the structure of how the story is told, and he's also looking at the rhyme. Now he's playing around with the rhyme because in a lot of the older poems, they used to use a iambic pentameter, which is a big word for just saying boom, 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 boom. That's the rhythm. And then they would have an A, or an A, B rhyme scheme. Now, Percy Bysshe Shelley knows that, but he's now playing with it and he's giving us some taste of rhyme, and then he throws us off. Because if you look, we've got read and fed, but we've got things. Kings, appear, despair, decay, away. So rhyme, he's playing around with the final syllable because it's the final syllable that actually creates rhyme in this. And it's not a perfect sonnet in the sense of how this is being structured, but a sonnet is a form of poem with 14 lines. And if we count the lines, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So all of a sudden, this is still moving around the idea of a poem, which is called a sonnet, with 14 lines. Now, this is how the structure of writing and poetry is so engaging, because it's like building construction. It's like building Lego or building something out of a plan. And there's a plan that goes with this poem. And we know that that plan, if we look at the previous poem, which was written by Horace Smith, we can see again, throws, knows, alone, stone, shows, disclose, Babylon, gone, express, wilderness, chase, race, place, guess, wilderness. And how many lines are there? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. How many syllables? In Egypt, sandy, silence, all, alone, 10. So you can see the structure of where Horace Smith, in his competition with Percy Shelley, they're structuring their poems in a very similar fashion. But you can see that Horace Smith's writing uses a lot of the older style of language, throw, which is short for through, and chase. It isn't spelt like that anymore, but it rhymes with place and race. And dwelt is an older word. So Ozymandias, though, has words that are more easily understood, but you can see that his word choice is famous too, because he's looking at the language. He's looking at these ideas he's trying to express. You know, boundless and bare. What a great 3 words or phrase linking these together. So I hope this has been interesting, but the question is, was there a real Ozymandias? Well, there was. And Ozymandias is a fascinating story because Ozymandias was the Greek name for a very, very famous pharaoh called Ramesses or Ramses II. He was one of the most powerful pharaohs ever to rule Egypt. In fact, he was the second longest ruler of all time. His dad, Seti, took over the throne from Tutankhamun. And Tutankhamun was a very weak pharaoh because he was only a 12-year-old boy. So you can see that when Seti took over the throne, he tried to restore the power of Egypt, and he passed his kingdom on to Ramesses, his son. He made Ramesses the heir to his throne at a very young age. Ramesses, aged 10, was a captain in his army, and he lived 1,300 years before the Common Era, what we call BCE. Some people call it before Christ, but we're not all Christian, so we call it BCE, which is 3,321 years ago. Now, that may seem like a long time, but when you think that there were First Nations people in this area where you're listening who lived here for 15 to 20,000 years ago and actually came to this nation, this country, over 60,000 years ago, it makes you realize that these ancient Egyptians were not as ancient as other civilizations and cultures. But that being said, the Egyptians had their battles. They had enemies. They had enemies in Libya. They had enemies called the Hittites. And the Hittites had great battles against the Egyptians. They consistently and constantly fought battles. And Ramesses defeated the Hittites. And what you're seeing, this image, is the image of a great temple he built to himself. And it's called the Temple of Abu Simbel. Now, Abu Simbel is a fascinating temple because when we look inside here, we can see a head. We can see trunkless legs of stone. And we can see a desert, or can we? Let me talk to you about that in a minute. This temple has a gateway, a passageway through, and at exactly the same time as when the battle was beaten and won, a light from the sun will shine through and it will radiate the back wall inside this temple, where you'll be able to see the inscriptions of the great battle where Ramesses beat the Hittites. So fascinating to think that Ramesses was a real person. The other thing was, did nature really overcome the great King of Kings? Because this is Abu Simbel today. And I implied earlier that there weren't sands, great desert sands, stretching for miles around. In fact, the whole area was dammed by the High Aswan Dam. And it's interesting that the person who dammed this area was another great general called General Nasser, who fought against the British and controlled the Suez Canal and brought Egypt back to a position of wealth and, I guess, international acclaim, because all of the great shipping routes, most of them getting to Europe, have to go through the Suez Canal. And when they dammed this area with Abu Simbel, they had to move every brick and rock, sandstone rock, 200 or so feet above where the dam water was going to be, so that they wouldn't lose this temple. And there you can see man actually refixing, reattaching those sneer of cold command, the shattered visage, the shattered, the trunkless legs of stone, which is a fantastic story because this is all about this man. I met a traveller from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them, on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive. Stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal, these words appear: My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away." And this is actually Ramesses II. They found the mummy. So when we're looking back through this area, we're starting to see that this is a real person in real time. Although we do have Ramesses II with us today, it's interesting to know that Abu's symbol is not Ramesses II. It's actually the work of the artist that survives. So it's nothing about the King of Kings. It's about art surviving through the ages. And it's interesting to note that where nature once was able to dominate and control all species on this planet, we now are in a scary, worrying position where man, humans, can control nature, can control the water to change the desert back to a lake. That is a significant piece for us all to remember, because the battles we have in the future may not be battles with enemies, they may be battles with ourselves as to what we want and what we hope to get from it. I hope you enjoyed this short session around Ozymandias. It's a fantastic poem, and the story behind it is even more interesting. The story of the author of Frankenstein keeping the heart of the poet who drowned, crying out that he would live longer than his father, and was washed up on a beach where his heart wouldn't burn. And yet the poem, the poetry remains today of the heart that fed.